Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's 2023 Qualified Clinical Data Registry Measure Development webinar. This presentation will be followed by a Q&A session where attendees will have an opportunity to ask questions via phone in the Q&A box, and CMS subject matter experts will address as many questions as time allows. To note, the slide deck and recording from today's session will be posted on the QPP webinar library within 2 weeks. Now I will turn it over to Dr. Dan Green from CMS to start the presentation.
Thank you, Olivia. So welcome everyone. So glad you all could join us today. We hope you'll find it beneficial as you consider submitting measures to the MIPS program as QCDR measures. So we hope you'll find the information that we present with respect to types of measures we're looking for and the criteria that we look for in measures. We hope you'll find that information useful. So again, do appreciate you joining us. We intend today to show you again some of the criteria we look for when we consider QCDR measures for approval and potential use in the program. For example, we're looking to move the needle in quality measurement in as much as we're not as interested, for example, in simple process measures, and clearly not standard of care or check the box measures. We're looking for more robust measures, particularly again, outcome measures, and they do need to address a gap in care, which is currently not represented either in the MIPS program or the QCDR measure inventory. So examples, again, there has to be an opportunity for clinicians to show improvement. If 98% of clinicians are already doing it, there's obviously not much room for improvement. Similarly, if measures, if look at conditions that are so rare that your average clinician, even a specialist, may only encounter a handful or a dozen cases in a particular year, those are tough measures to implement in a program such as MIPS because the numbers are too close to discern care from one clinician to another. So those would be measures, generally speaking, that may not be suitable for the program. We are looking for measures that do focus on the patient's experience of care. So patient-reported outcome measures are great in particular. We would like you guys to consider whether measures you submit for consideration could be used in a current or a new MVP as we transition away from traditional MIPS. Now, obviously, MIPS isn't going away next year or anything like that. So this is not a hard, fast requirement, but we would want you to look more broadly because obviously, if we can keep the measure in the program for a longer period of time, it's better use of your resources to develop the measure. So again, the whole idea behind this webinar is to make the use of your time more efficient and worthwhile, obviously realizing how expensive measure development is. So we want to try to be as conservative with those resources that you may have as possible. And to that end, as you all know, we've said on the support calls, CMS will be happy to meet with you if you decide that a measure preview call would be beneficial. I believe the dates, they'll review the dates that we do that, but it does start to happen now through the mid to late spring. And we're happy to listen to the topics or the concepts that you have, or certainly look at measures that are further in development. Now, we don't give thumbs up or thumbs down on those calls, but we do, encourage you, certainly if you're moving in the right direction of something we would strongly consider, or, try to make suggestions where appropriate that may make the measure more likely to be approved. So there are resources that'll help to guide your efforts on the Quality Payment Program Resource Library. And again, focusing on measure development within the library. So thank you for joining again. Let me pass it off to my co-leader, Sue Billett, for some additional information. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you. Hello, everyone. And again, thank you for joining. This presentation was prepared as a tool to assist, and although every reasonable effort has been made to assure its accuracy, ultimately the responsibility for the current submission of claims and response to any remittance advice lies with the provider of services. As this slide states, this is not a legal document. Our policies change frequently, and links to source documents have been provided within for your reference. CMS employees, agents, and staff make no representation, warranty, or guarantee that this information is error-free and will bear no responsibility or liability for the results or consequences of the use of this guide. Next slide, please. So the purpose of this webinar is to provide an overview of the QCDR measure basics, tips for a successful submission, including information regarding measure testing and additional QCDR measure requirements. Also, we will be looking ahead with reducing provider burden and transitioning to MVPs. We will then wrap up the presentation with a question and answer session. We do ask that you please keep questions QCDR measure related, as all other questions for other topics, such as MIPS policy, will be deferred. For additional guidance outside of what is covered in the work group today, we ask that you refer to the Quality Payment Program Resource Library or submit a ticket with the QPP Service Center. I will now turn it over to Stacy Sams of PIMS team to begin our presentation.
Thank you, Sue. So during our presentation today, we're going to be taking a deeper dive into QCDR measures. And I'm going to begin by providing just a brief high-level overview of the QCDR measure timeline, and then look at some of the additional QCDR requirements and considerations. Next slide, please. First of all, we want to provide a high-level timeline for QCDR measure development, measure review, and measure posting processes for a typical year. Beginning with the development of QCDR measures, this is an ongoing process for QCDRs. And during this time, QCDRs will be performing an environmental scan, developing measures and their specifications, testing the measures, etc. An opportunity that Dr. Green just mentioned that CMS provides each year for QCDRs is to help in this process are the QCDR measure preview calls. Near the beginning of each year and prior to the opening of self-nomination, we offer the opportunity for QCDRs to schedule a measure preview call. These are voluntary and can be helpful during this measure development phase. And this allows CMS and the PIMS team to review your measure concepts and provide useful feedback that will hopefully assist in the measure development and increase the chances for the measure to be approved for the program. And later in the presentation, we'll provide more detail on how to schedule one of those calls. Also during this time, CMS will publish their annual self-nomination resources, such as the QCDR Measure Development Handbook, fact sheets, and the QPP Web Form User Guide to the QPP Resource Library. And these resources can help assist you throughout the measure development and the self-nomination processes. The annual self-nomination process opens on July 1st and closes on September 1st. And during this period, QCDRs will be submitting their self-nomination along with QCDR measures they would like CMS to review and approve for use. And once CMS determines a QCDR's eligibility and whether they meet all the program requirements, the QCDRs go under review with CMS, and all measures that are self-nominated are reviewed with the PIMS team in multiple levels of CMS leadership. And any measures originally rejected during the initial review also go through an additional level of review with CMS. All measure decisions are then shared with each QCDR. For measures that were rejected, QCDRs are given the opportunity to submit edits or updates or to formally appeal the rejection by requesting a reconsideration call with CMS. And lastly, once all measure decisions are finalized, then CMS and the PIMS team begin the process of reconciling all of the approved measure specification files with each QCDR. And the approved QCDRs will review and help us to finalize the specifications for all approved QCDR measures during this part of the process. CMS then publishes all approved specification files to the QPP resource library. And once that's completed, the QCDR is then required to also post their own specifications to their website. Next slide, please. CMS asks that the following criteria are met when QCDR measures are developed and submitted. CMS looks for measures to be beyond the measure concept phase of development and that they address a significant variation in performance. QCDR measures must also meet the incremental testing policy for QCDR measures, which currently requires that new QCDR measures at a minimum must have face validity for the initial year for which it is approved. And for subsequent years, the measure will be considered an existing measure and must be fully developed and tested. Testing should be completed at the clinician level and prior to the measure being submitted at the time of self-nomination. And QCDRs are also required to be fully tested to be included in a MIPS value pathway or MVP. We'll be providing additional measure testing and MVP guidance later in the presentation. CMS also asks that any areas of duplication are addressed. It is the responsibility of the QCDR to complete a thorough environmental scan prior to developing a new measure. And this will help to not develop duplicative measure concepts that are already captured in MIPS. And if duplicative concepts are identified, QCDRs should be collaborating to address that duplication. Next slide, please. Next, we'll review QCDR measure specifications posting expectations. When QCDR measures are self-nominated, QCDRs are required to submit the measure specifications in their entirety. The QPP self-nomination web form, which is where you'll be submitting your QCDR measures, contains all the measure elements that are required with your submission. At a minimum, this should include the title and description of the measure, denominator, numerator, and if applicable, denominator exceptions and exclusions and numerator exclusions. Also, measure testing data, and if a measure is risk adjusted, those variables and algorithms should also be submitted. These are just a couple examples of the basic requirements, and there are more. Following CMS approval of QCDR measures, QCDRs are required to publicly post their approved measure specifications on their website and provide that link to CMS. They're given 15 calendar days from the date that CMS has posted all of the approved specifications on the QPP resource library. This link must be shared with CMS, and all of the measures and specifications should remain posted for the entire performance period for which they're approved and the applicable submission period. And we are noting both of these timeframes because they are different. We've seen measure specifications removed from the QCDR's website once the performance period for which it was approved has ended. However, the submission period for that performance period goes into the next year. Therefore, we ask that measures still be publicly available until the close of the submission period. Next slide, please. It is expected that QCDRs who submit a measure for approval are able to collect all of the data measure elements required for the measure and are able to feasibly implement the measure by January 1st of the applicable performance period. Additionally, all QCDR measures, whether new or existing, are reviewed by CMS every year. Measures are generally approved for one performance period with a 2-year approval option at CMS's discretion. An annual review is completed on all QCDR measures that are self-nominated, regardless of the previous year's approval status. CMS may still revoke the second year's approval if that measure meets any of the following. If the measure is topped out, if it's duplicative of a more robust QCDR measure that's submitted, if it's reflective of an outdated clinical guideline, or if the measure belongs to a QCDR who is not self-nominating or has been terminated. Next slide, please. QCDRs must also be able to link their QCDR measure to at least one of the following at the time of self-nomination as applicable and feasible: a cost measure, an improvement activity, or an MVP. QCDRs are required to provide a rationale as to how they believe their measure correlates to other performance category measures or activities with their self-nomination. If there is not a clear direct link to one of these items, then CMS would consider an exception if that QCDR measure otherwise meets all requirements and considerations. An example of an exception could be that maybe there's not a cost measure linked to a cost measure because that specialty is not currently reflected in the cost measures that are available. CMS does review all of this information and takes it into consideration during the annual QCDR measure reviews. Next slide, please. Now we will talk about some of the measure basics in the process of measure development. Next slide, please. First, we'll cover a few of the basics that CMS takes into account when reviewing QCDR measures for use in MIPS. QCDR measures should have a meaningful quality action, which is the numerator. The quality actions are the focus of the quality measure because that is what details the expected clinical activity for the designated population that is identified in the denominator. Ideally, the quality action should be outcome-oriented and address a health status change that results from the care provided, either desirable or adverse, and is not just a process of care. QCDR measures should also resolve areas of duplication with other measures, which we will touch upon later in the presentation. A measure must have a quality action with a known variation and gap in performance. You should be able to quantify the performance gap and variation in performance to be able to demonstrate that there is room for meaningful improvement. CMS also asks that you submit the performance data that has been collected or cite relevant literature, preferably within the last 5 years. If there's not a full years of performance data available, we ask that you submit any partial data that you may have. Lastly, QCDR measures should be evidence-based and should align with the most current clinical guidelines. Next slide, please. So each year, CMS and the PIMS team receive hundreds of QCDR measures for review during the self-nomination period. So we try to look at possible trends or common feedback that we may be giving to QCDRs to be considered during measure development. In these next few slides, we're going to walk through a few of the typical scenarios for your consideration to hopefully give you a better opportunity for the measure to be approved as a QCDR measure. The first one is submitting a measure that only captures the completion of an assessment or that a survey was completed. This is probably one of the most common scenarios that we see. CMS does prefer measures that focus on a robust quality action instead of just being a checkbox or documentation only measure. For example, if the numerator only requires the completion of an assessment or a survey, but there's no follow-up care or plan of care required to address any abnormal results from that assessment or survey, then that's not really considered a true quality action. Again, along those same lines, CMS preference is that measures do not just focus on a clinical process with a minimal link to an outcome. Precedence is for measures that focus on patient outcome, which could also include intermediate outcomes and patient-reported outcomes. Next slide, please. Another consideration is that a measure does not split a single measure into several different measures. An example, if there's a specific health condition that normally requires the completion of 3 different tests, it's preferred to have one comprehensive measure that combines all 3 of the tests instead of one measure split out for each individual test. And this composite structure could help to provide a broader, more comprehensive picture of quality. One example is MIPS quality measure 441, which is ischemic vascular disease, all or none outcome measure, optimal control. This measure looks at the optimal control of ischemic vascular disease. It includes 4 goals of care, which is blood pressure control, tobacco status, use of aspirin or another antiplatelet, and then the use of statin unless contraindicated. So this comprehensive all or none measure is preferred over having 4 individual measures for each of those components. We also ask that you do not duplicate an existing or retired MIPS quality measure or QCDR measure. You really want to collaborate with existing measure stewards to cover a broader patient population or clinical setting if similar measure concepts do exist. Lastly, we ask that you do not submit a measure that focuses on what we consider a never event. A common example is a fire in the operating room. It would happen so infrequently that there's very little to no variability distinguished between clinicians. So when there's less than a percentage separating the top performer from the bottom performer, it's really hard to distinguish and say that one clinician is doing significantly better than another. We do prefer measures that can quantify performance between clinicians. Next slide, please. We request that you choose the appropriate collection type also for measures. We do not want the collection of data or the reporting of the QCDR measure to be burdensome to the MIPS eligible clinician. So really the goal is to find things that work within the workflow and even consider existing coding systems to efficiently capture the patient population in quality action. We also do not want the measure to have potential or unintended consequences for patients. An example, we would not want to see a measure that discourages an oncology patient from receiving oxygen, for example, or other comfort measures at the end of life. One consideration to mitigate potential unintended consequences is to see if there's a need for a denominator exclusion or a denominator exception. And last but not least, we want measures that do not rely on standard of care with the expectation that it is performed consistently. These are considered low bar. And again, this goes back to ensuring the measure is addressing a performance gap. And we encourage QCDRs to investigate opportunities to revise the measure to include a comprehensive and robust quality action. Next slide, please. So in revisiting the concept of duplicative measures, during the measure development phase, it is very useful and is expected that a thorough environmental scan is completed to help identify any duplicative measure concepts that may already be available, addressing the same condition, outcome, or setting. We ask that you review the existing QCDR measures and MIPS quality measures inventories to identify similarities and differences in clinical concept, quality action, patient population, clinical care setting, clinician type, or other important factors. Addressing areas of duplication will reduce burden, can help improve scientific viability and increase the measure's importance. These measure inventories can be found on the QPP resource library, and the specific links will be provided in the resources section at the end of this presentation. If there are similar measures that are addressing the same concept, the data cannot be aggregated and compared across a larger cohort, which in turn can decrease the likelihood of establishing a benchmark. Next slide, please. So what happens if a new QCDR measure duplicates an existing measure? When this occurs, CMS will likely not approve the new duplicative measure and will suggest that QCDR obtain permission to use the existing measure that is similar in concept. If CMS does request that one or more QCDRs work to address areas of duplication, and that request is not completed, then CMS will review all similar measures during the self-nomination period and will approve the most robust measure. And they'll look at a number of different factors to determine which measure they feel is more robust, looking at the quality actions or if one measure covers a broader patient population than the other. Just a couple examples. And only under special circumstances, CMS may approve duplicative measures for one performance period under the condition that the QCDRs that are involved will address the areas of duplication for the subsequent year's consideration. Next slide, please. And as mentioned earlier, CMS is really moving towards inclusion of outcome-based measures in MIPS. Outcome measure focuses on the health status of a patient or the change in the health status, either desirable or adverse, resulting from the care that is provided. The next bullet speaks to the patient voice. Patient-reported outcome-based performance measures, or PRO-PMs, are based on the collection of data directly from the patient, and data is collecting using the PROM tool, which can be an instrument or a scale or a single item measure. And lastly, there's an intermediate outcome, which is a measure that assesses the change produced by a healthcare intervention that leads to a long-term outcome. It is closely linked to an outcome of interest, and there must be evidence showing that the measure's intermediate outcome does lead to a desirable health outcome. Next slide, please. I would like to now turn it over to Marla Throckmorton with the PIMS team, and she's going to continue discussion on QCDR measure review and tips for a successful submission. Marla?
Thanks, Stacy. Next slide, please. So this area is meant to be like a frequently asked questions, things that we have noticed that have created some issues during the self-nomination of the QCDR measures. One is the submission of the QCDR measure specifications using the self-nomination web form that's found within the qualified, within the QPP website. So before you submit your QCDR measures, please review all the measure specification components for accuracy. The specifications in their entirety should be submitted at the time of self-nomination. This means that it should be inclusive of all testing information, any and all performance data that is available, measure recommendations, and rationale. We've noted that sometimes we will find that performance data has not been submitted with the self-nomination, but we reach out to the QCDR and they actually do have some data available for us to be able to review that when considering the measure. Please note that borrowed measure specification details have to be submitted at the time of self-nomination as well. And if you've submitted measures before, you'll note that the borrowed measures have a very limited set of information that has to be submitted, as the owner's specifications are the ones that are used. Please be sure to complete a spell check and grammar check. Because this information does become publicly posted. Substantive revisions will not be accepted after the close of self-nomination. Revisions are limited to minor edits, such as grammar, punctuation, wordsmithing, etc. Also, please note that additional QCDR measures cannot be added after self-nomination closes. So after that September 1 deadline, MIPS measures or such as quality measures and ECQMs may be added after that deadline. Next slide, please. Sometimes there becomes a question about the performance rate submission and data aggregation for measures with multiple denominators or patient populations. So there are three basic ways to submit that information. One is to submit just one performance rate, and that means that the performance rate and the data have to be aggregated by the QCDR prior to submission. So when the information submitted, that overall performance rate is submitted. You can also select to submit multiple performance rates. This is, you indicate how to calculate the overall performance rate, for example, either a weighted or simple average. The QCDR then submits the measure data at the strata level, and then CMS aggregates that data for scoring. Then finally, you can also submit an overall performance rate as one of the listed performance rates. So for example, you may have 6 performance rates, and then you say that number 3 is the overall performance rate, but you would still submit the data for all the stratas listed, and then the QCDR must still aggregate the data for the overall rate prior to submission. Next slide, please. So ownership and eligibility of QCDR measures. For a QCDR measure to be active within the program, it must be owned or stewarded by an approved QCDR that is active for that performance period of MIPS. So in the event that a QCDR decides to not self-nominate for the next year, for example, and they own measures, but they still want those measures to have continued use in the program, the inactive QCDR may transfer measure ownership rights to an active MIPS-approved QCDR that is then able to continue to support that measure. The receiving QCDR or new owner must be able to provide that medical and measure expertise to be able to manage the measure. And that, of course, is a part of being approved as a QCDR for that performance period. Once a new owner or steward is determined, that new steward can permit other QCDRs to use the measure and go through that licensing process as they see fit. For QCDRs that are borrowing another QCDR's measures, the QCDR borrowing the measure can include, the permission must be granted at the time of self-nomination so that CMS can review the written proof of permission to be able to borrow that measure. Next slide, please. There are instances where a QCDR measure is not receiving the uptake that is expected for the measure, meaning that the providers or groups are just not adopting the measure. And if that occurs, a participation plan may be provided for the QCDR measure that didn't meet that benchmarking threshold for 2 consecutive performance periods. In other words, the data submitted is insufficient in meeting the case minimum and volume thresholds required for benchmarking. And that is usually 20 clinicians and 20 cases. So if a QCDR feels like that measure is still very important, and they want to try to have that measure maintained in the program, then the QCDR may submit a participation plan with their detailed plans and how they're going to encourage the eligible clinicians and groups to submit data on that low reported QCDR measure. The participation plan can include things such as development of an education and communication plan for their clinicians. They might update the QCDR measure specification to encourage broader participation or a larger denominator. They also may require reporting on the QCDR measure as a condition of reporting through the QCDR. Next slide, please. Regarding new measure IDs, QCDRs should not assign their own measure IDs to new or approved measures. Those IDs are assigned systematically during the specification approval process by CMS. Please note that if a measure, an existing measure, of course, a new measure would have to have a new measure ID assigned, but an existing measure that has substantive changes, if a new measure ID is deemed necessary, that will also update the first performance year, as it is then considered a new measure and it cannot be benchmarked against the previous ID. Examples of reasons why a new ID might need to be assigned, which this is not an all-inclusive list, is that the analytics might have changed from, for example, inverse to no longer inverse or proportional to ratio. You might add a risk adjustment. There might be additional quality actions added to the numerator. New denominator exclusions, which would reduce the denominator, would might require a new ID. And then sometimes there might be one or more QCDR measures that make sense to combine them into one single QCDR measure, and then that would require a new measure ID. Next slide, please. So let's talk about QCDR measure testing. Next slide, please. So kind of an update on that testing requirement that for the 2024 MIPS performance period. So this was true also in 2023, but moving forward into the 2024 self-nomination, which starts in July of this year, new QCDR measures at a minimum must have face validity prior to being self-nominated. Then after that initial year as a new measure, QCDR measures being submitted must have be fully developed and tested with complete testing results at the clinician level prior to submitting the QCDR measure. Please note that to be included in an MVP, a QCDR must be fully tested. So must be tested beyond that face validity. Next slide, please. So proper testing and analysis is critical to development of a feasible, reliable, and valid measure. Testing and analysis should be conducted during measure development, the alpha and beta testing. Testing and analysis enables developers to assess the strengths and weaknesses of the measure and then address those. It assesses the reliability and validity, feasibility, and usability of the QCDR measure. The scientific acceptability of the measure is that reliability and validity testing. The testing helps reduce provider burden by assuring that their effort is not wasted on collecting data on measures that are not feasible or informative or appropriate for the MIPS framework. Testing is an iterative process, which is conducted concurrently with measure specification development, which will yield more accurate and consistent data for performance program scoring. Next slide, please. Alpha, or formative testing, occurs before the detailed specifications are fully developed. This happens often during the information gathering process. It's done on a smaller scale and may be conducted multiple times throughout the specification process. This determines whether individual data elements are available and whether the form in which they exist is consistent with the intent of the measure. Types of testing done in an alpha test vary widely and often depend on the measure's data source or uniqueness of the measure specifications. The beta, or field testing, involves a more comprehensive and larger scope of testing than the measure specifications that are generated during the alpha testing. Beta testing assesses scientific acceptability and usability of a measure. It may also evaluate the measure's suitability for risk adjustment or stratification, and then further expands previous importance and feasibility evaluations. A carefully planned and well-executed beta test helps to establish evaluation criteria of later measure performance. Next slide, please. Measure reliability and precision. This evaluates whether the measured data elements produced the same results a high proportion of the time when assessed in the same population in the same time period, and/or that the measure score is precise. Reliability and precision refers to reproducibility of the same result from repeated measurement. The lack of precision demonstrates random error within a measure. Conceptually, reliability is the measure of the ratio between signal to noise. Signal being the proportion of variability in a measure due to true differences in performance. Noise is a proportion of variability in measure performance due to measurement error, or that random error that we discussed earlier. Reliability tests include inter-rater or intra-rater reliability and data abstractor studies, internal consistency for multi-item test or surveys, test and retest for survey items. And again, reliability reliability testing of the measure score addresses precision of measurement. Next slide, please. Measure validity accurately represents means whether the measure accurately represents the concept being evaluated, and does it achieve the purpose for which it is intended, i.e. measuring that quality action. It is often appropriate to obtain stakeholder inputs at several points during the testing process, which includes obtaining face validity inputs at alpha testing, feasibility and burden inputs at beta testing, and other inputs based on a review of overall results. For example, the QCDR must clearly identify the concept being evaluated, for example, face validity. It includes all necessary data elements, codes, and tables to detect a positive occurrence when one exists, for example, construct validity, and includes all necessary data sources to detect a positive occurrence when one exists. New measures will only require face validity as discussed. And after that initial year of implementation, existing measures should be tested with empirical validity, which means validity testing beyond that face validity. Construct validity, for an example, is an example of empirical validity. Next slide, please. But for those new measures, what is face validity? It is a subjective assessment by experts, and it shows the extent to which a measure appears to reflect what is supposed to be measured at face value. It's important because it determines whether the measure reflects its intended assessment, and is completed by a systematic and transparent process by a panel of identified experts. The expert panel should explicitly address whether measure scores provide an accurate reflection of quality and whether use of the scores can distinguish between good and poor quality. Care should be taken to standardize and document the process used, as this evaluation of a measure is very subjective. According to the National Quality Forum, they allow the use of face validity in lieu of empirical testing for new measures if a systematic assessment is performed and targeted to reflect accuracy of the targeted care measured. Next slide, please. Moving on to the aspect of validation, complex specifications may make a measure more susceptible to varying data field interpretation by different users. Small errors in the measure specifications, such as omission of codes for commonly documented concepts and value sets, can reduce the capture of appropriate patients in the measure's denominator. Users may enter information into specified measure fields other than those from which the QCDR extracts or abstracts the data for measure reporting. Threats to validity can be, in addition to unreliability, the specifications and data can affect the validity of conclusions about quality. Potential threats include patients excluded from measurement, differences in patient mix for outcome and resource use measures, measure scores generated with multiple data sources, methods, multiple measure specifications, and then missing data and non-response. Next slide, please. Measure feasibility. Ideally performed very early in the measure development process, after identification of the required data for measure calculation and before that specification is finalized. The goal of feasibility is to make sure that the required data is available and retrievable without undue burden. It is the extent to which developers can collect data and process it for performance measurement without violation of patient confidentiality. Feasibility estimates the cost or burden of data collection, data entry, and analysis, including the impact on clinician workflow, diagnostic thought processes, and also patient-physician interaction. It also helps identify unintended consequences and as well as barriers that could occur during implementation of that quality measure specification, the way the data is abstracted, measure calculations, and then on to the performance reporting. Measure feasibility information can be obtained when assessing measure validity of the data elements using systematic surveys or conducting focus groups. Next slide, please. Evaluating that scientific acceptability from an NQF or National Quality Forum perspective, testing can produce both reliable and valid results. Empirical testing demonstrates the reliability and validity that is expected in the measure, although as discussed, new face validity for those new measures. NQF is not prescriptive about how empirical measure testing is done, as well as NQF does not set minimum thresholds for reliability or validity testing results. Reliability and validity must be demonstrated for the measure as specified, including the data source and level of analysis. NQF allows testing at either the data element level using patient level data or at the performance measure score level using data that has been aggregated across providers. When evaluating measure testing results, the method of testing, the data used for testing, often from a sample, and the results of that testing must be considered. Next slide, please. Looking ahead and then on to the transition to MVPs. Next slide, please. These are the things that CMS is focusing on: reducing clinician burden. CMS wants to focus on measures that reduce reporting burden, such as using administrative claims or digital quality measures, aligning measures across programs where appropriate. Want to emphasize the utilizations of measures included in the core quality measures collaborative. Emphasize implementations of quality measures that are aligned or similar across programs. Also related to, for example, the digital quality measures is integration of that new data interoperability with fast healthcare interoperability resources, or FHIR data model. Next slide, please. Goals, transitioning to MVPs. The goal of the MPP is to begin with the 2023 performance period that QCDRs and qualified registries must support MVPs that are applicable to the MVP participants on whose behalf they submit MIPS data. So if your clinicians, for example, are an example would be the emergency department MVP. If you have emergency department physicians, then those would be the type of MVP that you should and must support. The goal of an MVP is to move away from that siloed reporting by offering connected measures and activities across the 4 MIPS performance categories. Incorporate a set of administrative claims-based quality measures that focus on population health, provide data and feedback to clinicians, and also enhance information provided to patients. MVPs, the goal is to result in comparative performance data that is valuable to both patients and caregivers in evaluating a clinician performance and making decisions about their care. It reduces the number of measures available for selection and allows for a more cohesive participation experience. Next slide, please. MVPs were created to combine a smaller, more cohesive set of measures and activities that can be reported by a majority of clinicians who fall under the umbrella of an MVP's intent. Beginning with the 2023 performance year, CMS, again, we mentioned this earlier, CMS does require that the QCDRs and qualified registries, as well as health IT vendors, identify and support MVPs that are relevant to their clinicians and groups. MVP participants will select 4 quality measures available within the selected MVP. One of those must be an outcome measure or high priority if an outcome measure isn't available. What impact will the transition to MVPs have on current QCDR measures? QCDR measures will be reviewed as components of future MVPs. Questions asked will be, does the QCDR measure align with a current or future MVP topic? Does the QCDR measure complement improvement activities and cost measures? Does the QCDR measure align with the goal of keeping MVPs stable year over year? And the impact is also that it creates a streamlined approach to MIPS reporting. Next slide, please. So for a QCDR measure to be considered and included in an MVP, the measure must be fully tested at the clinician level. It must be reliable, feasible, and valid as to not inadvertently cause a clinician or group an issue with submission, calculation, and scoring of that given measure. CMS needs to receive QCDR measure testing data for review by the end of the self-nomination period, no later than September 1, to be eligible for proposal within an MVP. The QCDR measure must be self-nominated as a QCDR and submit QCDR measures for CMS consideration within the 60-day self-nomination period, occurring July 1 to September 1 of the calendar year prior to the applicable performance period. And the QCDR measure must be active for 1 year prior to self-nomination to be considered for inclusion, self-nomination to the MVP, to be considered for inclusion within a candidate MVP. Next slide, please. Resources. Next slide, please. One of the very important resource that CMS is committed to is giving the opportunity for a preview measure concept and call, which and that allows CMS to provide feedback prior to the self-nomination of the measure. The calls this year will be held starting February 20th through June 2nd. The deadline to request a call will be May 19th of 2023. Calls will be scheduled on a first come, first serve basis for those that have not yet had a call to accommodate all requests. To request the call, you can submit an email to the QCDR vendor support at gdit.com. We request that you provide multiple dates of availability over approximately a 2-week period. Include the names and email addresses of those you'd like to be invited to attend. The QCDR measure concepts and specifications must be submitted at least 1 week prior to the scheduled meeting in a single Word or Excel document. We do prefer an Excel document. If it's not received 1 week prior to the scheduled meeting, the meeting is subject to be rescheduled. And that is just so that the PIMS team can do a thorough job to vet the concept and be able to actually have a very informative and productive call. Please note that measure decisions won't be made during the QCDR measure call. At the time of the call, CMS and the MIPS team, PIMS team does not have full exposure to what all measures will be submitted during that self-nomination. Next slide, please. Other items of note is the physician fee schedule, which is on here at the Federal Register, the final rule resource, as well as the blueprint, which is very important. Please note that now the blueprint is no longer just an actual document, but is truly a hub on the cms.gov website. Next slide, please. These are other resources that might assist you as you are working through measure development. Next slide, please. ECQI related to electronic clinical quality improvement. The ECQI Resource Center is a one-stop shop. Next slide, please. And then more importantly, again, as we've talked about how this is truly a focus, is the MVP resources. And these are links to the one-stop shop for the most current resources to support MVPs. Next slide, please. This link will give you the transition from traditional MIPS to MVPs. It's showing you how CMS plans to make that transition. And then the Explore MVPs webpage. It helps you learn about all the finalized MVPs, including the measures and activities within each MVP. Next slide, please. We're now going to move into the question and answer portion of our webinar today. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And yes, we are now starting the Q&A portion of the webinar. So just a quick reminder, you can ask questions via the Q&A box or through the webinar audio. And to ask a question via the webinar audio, please just go ahead and raise your hand. There should be a button at the bottom of your screen, and we will unmute your line so that you can speak. The first question that we did receive was just for clarification on what the difference between a QCDR and a qualified registry is.
Hi, this is Anastasia with the PIMS team. I just wanted to provide a little bit of information between the QCDR, third-party intermediary type, as well as the qualified registry. Now, this call typically processes just information on the QCDR vendor type because QCDRs are able to submit QCDR measures for consideration. With that being said, qualified registries are not able to submit or support QCDR measures. So if your organization wishes to self-nominate and potentially submit QCDR measures for consideration during self-nomination, then you would have to attempt to self-nominate as a QCDR and not a qualified registry. Please note that all of the requirements for a QCDR would of course need to be met in order to be accepted as a QCDR.
Great, thank you. And the next question we received says, will the transition from NQF to Battelle impact testing guidance? Does Battelle have an additional information on testing plans or what good looks like to share with QCDR measure developers?
Hi, this is Colleen from the PIMS team. Currently, we do know there's lots of questions about the change from NQF to Battelle. Currently, for the purposes of QCDR measures, as we have a separate self-nomination process, there will not be any changes at this time to the testing plans. That said, Battelle, as the new consensus-based entity endorser, they may have changes over time, and those should be reflected in the MMS measures hub, and we will also disseminate that information as it comes.
Great. And we did receive another question that says, does a QCDR measure need to be tested at the clinician level every year? We had 6 fully tested measures approved for 2023. Do we repeat validity and measure testing for 2024 self-nomination?
Hi, this is Olga from the PIMS team. If the measure has not undergone any significant changes to the specifications, you do not need to retest the measure. However, if there are changes to the measure, then it would be up to the measure developer to determine whether you need retesting.
Great, and we did receive, looks like one person has their hand raised. Josette, we just unmuted your line, so you will have to unmute on your end and then you can ask your question.
Hello, thank you for having me. My office group has a problem with the software company. It turns out that they can only create the individual doctor's CQDR and not as a group. My office has over 15 doctors. My individual doctor is not passing, so we were hoping to move as a group, but unfortunately that software vendor made it quite clear they're not able to pull my entire group of doctors with a one QCDR file, which is I believe that is the format. It cannot be individual QCDRs for a group. It has to be just one file. What do you advise about that? I mean, the software vendor just doesn't have the capability.
This is Anastasia again with the PIMS team. Unfortunately, we do not have any of our technical SMEs on the phone today, as this call was dedicated just to QCDR measures, as well as the topics related to that. So unfortunately, we don't have the SMEs to answer your question. I can certainly send you the information to our Quality Payment Program Service Center, and then your ticket or your question can be routed to the appropriate SMEs that can certainly address more of the technical based response there.
Okay, and just a reminder for folks, if you do want to ask a question, please go ahead and submit it through that Q&A box. We will give it another minute or so for people to go ahead and type a question. And again, just another reminder, if you do have a question, please go ahead and submit your question through the Q&A box. We have seen a couple of questions about when the slides and recording will be available, and we will coordinate and post those on the QPP webinar library within the next 2 weeks. Okay, it doesn't look like we've received any more questions. So Sue, we will hand it back over to you to close out the call.
Thank you. CMS thanks you for attending today's webinar. The team hopes you found this presentation educational as you prepare for the upcoming submission period, and I hope everyone has a wonderful day. Thank you.